So I just wanted to start with, saying I am from Chandler, Arizona. I understand the aspect that um, Arizona is not just that soaring desert that we think about with the cactus, and that it varies across the whole state with moisture, snow, different vegetation. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about can be applied throughout the state of Arizona. Um, Just want to open up with a quote that I came across the other day from Gandhi that was really good. It says, "The greatness of a nation can be judged by the way its animals are treated." And based on this quote, I would say that that's our goal as livestock producers, as small ruminant producers, to provide the best life for our animals that we can while they're in our care. So today I'm going to talk mainly about different types of sheep parasites, some of the more common ones that we work with, that we see across the West and really across the United States. But there are a lot of them, right? So for time's sake, we're not going to be able to go in detail across every one of them, but we'll talk about a couple key ones and then some management decisions that we can do to help alleviate some of the stress that they cause on our operations. They're really broken down into two different categories. One being external parasites and the other being internal parasites. External parasites are biting midges, sheep lice, the sheephead, which we'll talk about a little bit, bot flies. I do know some producers in southern Utah that are on irrigated pastures that have issues with fly strike. As far as our internal parasites, we deal with the Barber worm, which we'll talk about, and Coccidia are probably the two biggest ones that we have to deal with. There are others such as liver flukes and things like that, but the Barber worm we'll get into, and Coccidia a little bit. So the first one in our external parasite category is the sheephead. So the sheephead, we often look at this parasite on our sheep and we call it a tick. However, the sheephead, which the scientific name, Melophagus ovinus, is actually a wingless fly. There are a bunch of subspecies of this type of parasite. Some of them have partially developed wings, and some others have no wings at all. But one thing that's common across all of them is that they are blood feeders. So they will feed similar to how a tick feeds and fill up on blood of the animal. So the sheephead spends the entirety of their life on the animal and generally is passed through contact. One thing that does bring a little bit of comfort to us, though, is that sheepheads are very species specific. They like sheep and they stay on sheep, okay? So as we're shearing and doing other things with sheep, we don't need to really worry about sheepheads latching on to us and coming home with us. Maybe coming home with us, but not necessarily latching on and feeding onto us. However, ticks will do that, right? An adult female sheephead can generally live for 4 to 6 months and produce up to 20 larvae. In these pictures, on the bottom left-hand side and in the middle, we can see what an adult sheephead looks like. And you can see how it does look a little bit different than a tick, which is an arachnid, more like a spider. Okay, and here's what the larva looks like inside a pupal case. Okay, so they'll cement these cases into the wool on the kind of near the base skin of our sheep, and they'll stay there until their time to hatch. There's been some research really showing kind of the seasonality of sheepheads, when the populations are greatest, and then also where they like to hang out on our sheep. So this study done with some Wyoming sheep, they mapped out kind of where these sheep like to live, or where these sheepheads like to live on our sheep. And so they drew up this diagram to kind of let us know the different areas on the body. And what they found is that the vast majority of sheepheads like to hang out on the thigh, ribs, and shoulder area of our sheep. So if we're running our sheep down the alleyway and we're parting the wool and looking down into the wool of our sheep, and we don't see any sheepheads, and we have this wonderful thought of, oh, awesome, I have no parasite issues, we can be mistaken, because generally they don't like to hang out on the back of the sheep. Likewise, they don't really hang out in the belly area. The belly area is generally where that wool is compressed, shorter. And so for thermal regulation and other reasons, they hang out in the thigh, ribs, and shoulder area of our sheep, okay? Another thing is that these, during cool season is when our sheepheads increase in their population densities. So in this graph right here, you can see that in the months of February and March is when those sheephead populations really start to increase in our flocks. One thing that is nice though, is this is also around the same time that we are generally shearing our sheep. And so we'll talk about that as a prevention measure, but it lines up really well in the fact that we shear our sheep around the same time that these populations are high. And then those populations come back down as the months warm up in June, July, and August, okay? So why does this matter? Well, sheepheads, they can really cause issues on the pelt of our animals. It reduces the ability for the pelt to hold any kind of dye, and also reduce weight gain. So if you're planning on selling a truckload of lambs, or you're taking lambs to auction, if you have serious sheephead issues, you can expect to lose about 8% of the weight gain that you would normally get. I'd also decrease those of us who have wool type sheep. It'll decrease the quality of our wool. And those lambs that are really infected, it can cause an anemic state since they are blood feeders. So how do we treat them? Well, like I said, we're kind of lucky that those populations are really high in those cool seasons, a little bit before lambing, that we generally start lambing, because one of the best methods to get sheepheads off of our animals is to shear them. Shearing them alone takes about 75% of that burden off our animals, and also helps us decrease those ewes infesting lambs, newborn lambs, with these parasites. Generally, a permethrin-based product used after shearing is pretty effective as maybe a Poron or something else. And those animals that you buy that you're unsure about, you should treat them and maybe keep them away from the rest of your animals for a given number of time. And this is not only good with parasites, but across a lot of different diseases that we may deal with by introducing new animals into our flock. So getting into more internal parasites like Coccidia. Coccidia isn't a roundworm like the Barber poleworm that we're going to talk about in a little bit. It's actually just a single-celled protozoa. And what it does is it causes damage on the lining of the small intestines. And because of this, it generally manifests itself in showing diarrhea, or sometimes there may be blood or kind of mucus associated with that diarrhea. Some of the best treatments that we can have with our lambs are especially susceptible, and sometimes our older ewes are susceptible to Coccidia, is we can use a variety of different ways to treat this. We can use additives into our feed, or a mineral, or even our water. So depending on your setup, you can choose which one works best for you. There's Bovatec, decoquinate and decox works really well mixing into like a free choice mineral, and then a Corid that you add into water, and then always follow the directions. And then if you're trying to do something off label, make sure you talk to your veterinarian before you do that. Okay, now let's move into the Barber poleworm, and we'll get into that word that Jim talked about with refuge in a little bit. But the scientific name for the Barber poleworm is Homonicus cotortus, okay? Assuming I pronounced that right. It's a blood-sucking parasite, and the reason that it's called the Barber poleworm is because of this distinct Barber pole type pattern of white and red across the body. And all this is with this blood-sucking parasite is that it attaches and it feeds on the animal in the abomasum of our sheep, which is kind of their last chamber of their stomach. And the blood is represented in the red, and the white are eggs. So all this parasite does is it feeds and it lays eggs, okay? And it can become very problematic in those places that get it. So some of the ways that we can tell that we're dealing with this particular parasite is our animals become anemic. And we can see this through pale mucous membranes. The eyelid is a very good indicator looking at the anemic state of our animals. Edema under the jaw, or we call this bottle jaw, that buildup of fluid. Sometimes they're just ill thrift. They'll heads down, they'll separate themselves. They won't feed at the feed bunk very well. And then if we're not on top of it, sometimes we can just have death before we really know we have a problem. So one way that we can try to find out whether or not we have parasites is we can do something called fecal egg counts. So we collect feces from our animals, preferably fresh, right? And we can send them off and get the feces counted for the type of eggs that are in it to identify which parasites we're dealing with. And then also how many are we dealing with? What is the burden load in our sheep? So generally about 20% of our sheep carry about 80% of the burden when we're talking about the Barber pullworm. So in Utah, our vet diagnostic lab does this fecal float to count these eggs for about $10. So you could sub-sample a bunch of ewes in your flock and send it off to see what kind of parasite you're dealing with. I'm sure Arizona has a very similar setup, and if we wanted to type that in the chat for people to reference, that would be great. And it really only requires a small amount of feces, about 3 ounces or so. So the way we can treat these particular worms is through a variety of dewormers. And when we do this, we should generally do it on the weight of our animals. But if we can't really weigh all of our individual animals, treat it for the heaviest animals because we don't want to be underdosing our animals. There are really only 3 main families of drugs that we deal with. There are a large variety of different marketed drugs, but many of the active ingredients that kill our parasites have these 3 main families. So there's benzimidazoles, that includes valbazin or Safeguard, nicotinics, which includes Prohibit, macrolytic lactones, which is ivermectin, and sidectin. Okay, and so many of these work pretty well, depending if you have kind of gained any resistance to these drugs or not, if those parasites have gained any resistance. We'll talk about that in just a sec. So what we're seeing happen in the sheep industry, because we have some tools, but these dewormers, even at their best, they kill up to 98% of our parasite burden. So there's a small percentage of worms or parasites that are left that start becoming resistant to our dewormers. So the Barber pullworm can become pretty resistant to our dewormer over time. And in the South, this has become a big problem. In a lot of flocks, none of these dewormers work anymore, okay? So to avoid some of this resistance, some things that we should not do, we should not underdose, okay? We shouldn't treat all of our animals, even the healthy ones, and we'll talk about why we do that, the refugia aspect of it. And then we should not remove animals to clean pastures after deworming. So give them a time after deworming that they can expel all those eggs out onto maybe a dirty pasture that you're already on. So how do we tell if this dewormer is actually working? Well, going back to those fecal egg counts we talked about, we can do a fecal egg count reduction test. So we can sample 10 ewes in our flock. We can send off to do fecal egg counts. We can deworm those ewes with maybe an ivermectin, whatever dewormer we're using. And then after a number of days, 7 to 10 days, we collect feces from those ewes again and send them off. And then we look to see what percentage reduction that we have and whether or not our dewormer is still working. So if we have a 95% reduction, that means that those worms have not built up any resistance and our dewormer is still working really good. If there's less than a 60% reduction, then we're starting to deal with a pretty severe resistance to that dewormer, and it's not working as well. So identify a dewormer that works for you. And it used to be that we used to rotate through a lot of dewormers, but the new protocol that people are saying is that we should use the one that works for us selectively, and when it stops working, move on to the next. So, but we're in really arid environments, right? So we think, well, these aren't issues for us. A study that recently came out just last year shows that across the Intermountain West, Montana, Wyoming, and some parts across Utah, and this goes to Arizona too, is that those numbers of farms that are on irrigated pastures, that you can almost guarantee that this barber pullworm will be present, okay? So irrigated pastures are especially susceptible to this barber pullworm. And as this is more particular to Utah, but we're seeing an increasing amount of farms that are, only on 1 to 9 acres. And a lot of them are on the same pasture over and over, and they're consuming a lot of these eggs that are laid into the grass of these barber pullworms, or they're on irrigated pastures. So the one tool that we can use that's starting to become more popular, and I think will really benefit a lot of us, is that we can use something called Fomacha, okay? And so what this is it essentially helps us to use a grading system so that we only treat those animals that are doing poorly with the parasite burden. So it essentially helps us leave a population of parasites that never become resistant to our dewormer because they were never introduced to dewormer in the first place. So this is what we call refugia, going back to what Jim had talked about earlier. So making sure that there's a number of parasites that have never been with that dewormer, make sure that there's some in that population pool that are never resistant to our dewormers. So with Fomacha, we look at the mucous membrane of their eyes, which was the indicator of how anemic they were, and we score them depending on how red or pale it is. If they score a score of 3, 4, or 5, we treat them with our dewormer. If they score less than that, that's not to say that they might not have parasite burden, but they seem to be doing well, okay? So we don't want to treat them with that. But treating these becomes very important, especially these 4 and 5s, because these animals can go downhill pretty fast. Okay, this works with sheep and goats, and I think also works a little bit with some of our camelids like alpaca and llamas too. Okay, a really great site that maybe some of you should go to is WormX, and that really helps. The last thing that I'm going to touch on is there is a genetic component to this. So not every breed is the same. Some hair sheep like St. Croix and Katahdin are more parasite resistant. They can handle more of that burden. And then also this resistance is somewhat heritable, about 20 to 40% heritable. So over time, if you're breeding those ewes that never seem to have an issue, you can slowly choose for those animals that handle parasites better in your environment. So these are some things to think about. So just overall, external and internal parasites, they're pretty common in our operations, and we just need to learn how to deal with them. Shearing is a good thing to do prior to lambing to get that parasite load off. And then even though we can't eliminate our internal parasites completely, we can effectively manage around them with our sheep and goats using something like Fomacha. So I think that's about all the time I have, but I'll open it up for any questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice presentation. I learned something for sure. And so one question we have, and people please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A. So is it safe to use the permethin products, and are those pour-on pregnant ewes after shearing?
Yes. So a lot of these permethrin-based products, they are designed to use after shearing, and we're generally shearing right before or in the last so many weeks before lambing. And so depending on, what type you buy, some are more concentrated than others, and some you have to dilute down. But as long as you follow those instructions, you should be fine, and there's no negative consequences to our lambs.
Okay, I do want to note, Jim put a note in the chat when you were talking about refugia that it has to be fecal samples from the same animals to be accurate.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, and going along with that, you can purposely select those animals that are doing bad instead of randomly selecting, because, like I said, about 20% of those ewes are carrying 80% of the burden. Okay.
Okay, excellent. So we have, is it suggested to do 2 doses of the Cydectin injectable to catch eggs as well?
I guess I'm not quite as familiar with some of our injectables as I am our dosage, our drenches. Maybe Jim, sounds like he's a parasite guy a little bit, could comment on that.
Jim, you in?
But I can get.
It won't unmute me. There, it unmuted me. And unless they change it, we actually sold Cydectin a few years ago. But unless they had a major change, cattle are the only thing on the label.
Yeah.
Now there's a Cydectin sheep drench, but the injectable and the pour-on are only for cattle, only labeled for cattle.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So we have another, how resistant are merino sheep to parasites?
Yeah, so I mean, every parasite is different, right? And every breed is different. But merino sheep have not been selected over time or haven't evolved in maybe tropical climates like our Katahdin sheep or St. Croix sheep. And so they're not labeled as one of those sheep that is more resistant to parasites. But over time, if you select those ewes that do better with parasites, you can build up a flock that can do well in your environment.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another, what are churro sheep susceptible to?
I would say churro sheep are susceptible to all these same things, right? So a lot of the times we don't think of churro sheep in maybe humid environments or parasite infected environments when they're out on range and eating sagebrush or maybe other forages. But as far as external parasites, Coccidia, we should treat them like all our other sheep.
Okay. Do we have any other
joke and say cinnamon?
Say that again, Duarte.
I'll do my dad joke and say cinnamon is probably not good for churro.
Churro sheep. Yes, I was thinking. I like churros. Sounds tasty, but
yeah.
Okay, no more dad jokes, Duarte. All right. So I don't see any more questions, but are you staying with us for the rest of it as well?
Yeah, I'll stay on. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So if anything comes to mind, you can ask questions for people who have already finished their presentations. Thank you so much. That's a great presentation. So we actually have about a 5 or so minute bio break. So if you need to refuel or defuel, then you go ahead and help yourself. And then we will come back and we will hear about assessing and mitigating heat stress. So about 5 minutes or so, and we'll see you shortly. Oh, we got a question. What helps with nose spots?
Oh, okay. So, nose spots are actually a pretty funny thing. Nose spots, even though it causes maybe a lot of irritation and a little bit of decrease in, gain, they don't generally have a huge impact on production. And so a lot of our sheep can live and reproduce with nose spots. But there are some, medications and tricks that we can use to try to help reduce that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead if you have something else.
Oh, no, you're fine, Betsy.
Okay, well then we will take a 5-minute break and we'll be back shortly.